welcome to the Covert Access Team podcast. Today, I am very privileged to be with Mike Holcomb. He is the fellow and global lead for ICS OT cybersecurity at Fluor, where he helps secure massive industries on a global level, from power plants to rail systems to manufacturing and refineries. He's also a community builder and educator. He's got lots of content where you can learn to get started with ICS and OT cybersecurity courses. He runs a newsletter, Guarding the Gears, that you should definitely sign up for. And he was the founder of B-Sides ICSOT and B-Sides Greenville. So welcome, Mike, for being here. We're really happy to have you on.
Yeah, no, thanks, Brian. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
So can you tell me, I hope I got all that right, but can you tell me a little bit about you and how you got into all this?
Yeah, yeah, the bio works, but yeah, where I'm at today, and you kind of touched on it. My day job, I work for one of the world's largest engineering and construction firms. So I get to work with not only some of the best engineering minds literally in the world, but we build, some of the world's largest industrial, OT, ICS control system facilities. Everything from, we just finished a $50 billion LNG facility for Shell. We build nuclear weapons for the United States government, so just little environments. And
Little small projects.
right, exactly. So, but I get, I get to work, with, again, all these great engineers, and help them in turn, understand security and how we secure these environments. And so that's what I do in the day job. And then you mentioned, yeah, I post on LinkedIn and YouTube primarily to help people, whether they want to learn about OT or ICS cybersecurity, right? How to get into industry, and how to secure critical infrastructure in these types of environments, or owners and operators that they might not have a program today on securing their environment. And so that's also a focus for me, because especially we have a lot of folks that now are handed an OT cybersecurity program, and they come from IT, like I do. I come from an IT cyber background, and they're like, I don't know what to do. It was like, it's okay, don't panic, right? Stay calm, carry on. It's actually not as complicated as people think it is. So, and it seems maybe mysterious, or it's like that black box at first, but once you just take a little bit to actually learn the basics, it's not actually that complicated. So, but yeah, so that's kind of what I do in the day job, and on the side doing the content. I have a bunch of courses on YouTube, where people can learn about different aspects of OT, ICS, cybersecurity. I actually just started my OT pen testing course. So I think part 3 actually just posted today, which is really cool. And that's going to end up being probably 12 or 13 parts. So,
Wow.
but that's a lot of fun to get to share with people, for sure. And I used to do a lot of IT pen testing, back in the day. Um, but and I had gotten into OT. I think I mentioned, I've been an IT or computer nerd since day one, like since, probably grade school, junior high. And it was just something I always focused on. Grew up with a kind of more traditional hacker kiddie that, he'd write cheats for games and crack, games so you could copy them illegally. But I was always the good kid, right? I would watch him, but I would never do anything. So I was just a witness. But and I just always, the security aspect though kind of always stuck with me, because like Chris, super nicest guy you'd ever meet. But then it was like, what would somebody like with bad intentions do, with that knowledge or that level of skill? And I just always carried that through my career. So in going to IT, I was, working in cybersecurity pretty quickly before we even called it cyber. Got to do a lot of great thing. I got to like work with the U.S. Navy SEALs for 2 years, mostly their support teams. Like I'm not, out doing 100 pull-ups, but that type of work. And then mentioned, I was even doing pen testing, worked for telecom for a little bit. But 2010 was when Stuxnet. came out. And for those not familiar with Stuxnet, long story short, the Americans and the Israelis had teamed up to build incredible piece of malware that got into a air-gapped environment at the Natanz facility in Iran. So this is where they had the the centrifuges to enrich uranium gas to be used to build nuclear weapons. And I was really fascinated with it. And it wasn't because, like, yes, it had four Windows 0 day vulnerabilities that it would exploit. Like, okay, I mean that's interesting, but it's kind of like been there, done that. And it's like, oh, it got into an air-gapped environment, so that environment's not supposed to have any connection to an outside network. And like, okay, that's interesting. But where I was just absolutely fascinated was the malware would take control of over the Siemens controllers or the systems that would in turn control these centrifuges. And then it would essentially spin them up, spin them down, spin them up, spin them down, so that over time it uses physics to physically break them down. And I was just absolutely fascinated with, like, oh yeah, like you can reach out and you can control something in the real world, because I grew up watching war games and hackers and Max Headroom. I don't know if you've ever seen that show, or there's like a show when I was a little kid called Whiz Kids, right? They're hacking in and changing the traffic lights to stop the bad guys from getting away, that type of stuff. So I was absolutely fascinated. And then where it even got more fascinating was Stuxnet. The real beauty was if you were sitting in the control room watching all the lights and the dashboards to see what was going on in the environment, everything looked like it was perfectly fine. Yet behind the scenes, right, all the centrifuges were slowly breaking down, and it took them months and months to even figure out what the heck was going on. And they only figured it out because the worm essentially escaped the facility and started spreading to other computers in the outside world. So yeah, that was at that point I was really, I got bit by the bug and started asking questions like, how does this work in a power plant? Right? Do we have computers in a power plant? Like, I don't know. And so that was, where I started my journey. And then about a year and a half or so later, I actually got my job at Fluor, and had no idea what they did. And I just, didn't like my last job or my last boss. Just had to get out of there. Ended up there and realized we're an engineering company. I'm like, yeah, we probably have some of these control systems around here, and just started having those conversations. So.
Okay, so honestly, that's a very very impressive resume. But so you said your company makes nuclear weapons. You've hung out with a bunch of Navy SEALs, and you're very knowledgeable about Stuxnet, which is probably one of the most fascinating malware that's ever been publicly released.
It still is, right? Yeah, for sure. Yeah, right. Exactly. Publicly released is is the key.
So one question that I have is, how exactly did they get the malware into the Iranian centrifuges, if you know?
Well, so it depends on who you ask, right? There was actually a story going around, was it about this time last year, about um, for something around it got in on the firmware on a system related to one of the water pumps for the facility. I think that got debunked. I actually had one acquaintance that worked at the NSA that mentioned that the ship carrying some of the controllers, because these were actually Siemens controllers, but that the ship actually made a unscheduled stop at a port in the United States, and people snuck on and then, you know, added things to it. I think that was debunked. I did have somebody, and I can't share it, but I do have somebody that I believe actually does know. And yeah, it was tricking somebody to carry it into the facility.
Ah,
Yeah.
so social engineering.
Yes, yes, in kind of a long about way, that. would probably be associated with, one of the three-letter agencies.
Yeah, they tend to be involved
So,
in these types of things.
right, yeah, and I could completely be completely wrong as well. There are folk, Jake Williams, he got outed as a member of that team. Um, by the Russians, which was another whole right interesting aspect of that whole story, right? So I'm sure like he really knows, and but yeah, I've heard a couple of different stories, but yeah, that's it's how do you get into an air gapped environment, right? And are you dropping USB drives in in the parking lot, or are you infecting somebody's laptop that they take into the facility? Might might be something along those lines. I think that's typically what we see when we talk about even just that's you have contractors coming in and out of these environments, especially as they're being commissioned, but over time and doing things like maintenance, and you know you don't know where that laptop's been, right? Or somebody bringing in a USB drive, or now I can't tell you the last time I've been in an environment where I didn't see somebody's phone plugged into an engineering workstation, right, charging. And it's like, okay, I'm sure, innocently, right, maybe it's just charging, but is it just charging, right? Is it compromised? Or, if anything, it's that engineering workstation, which is on your air-gapped OT network, now has an internet connection, right? So that, yeah, there's a lot of
So,
considerations
so you
there.
see that all the time. You see like that type of
All
vulnerability all the time.
all the time. Yeah, between that and it's just over the last year or two or three. I mean, the phones everywhere. And then the other thing is it seems pretty rampant where contractors will come in and they won't even think anything of it. And I kind of get it, right? It's a small mom and pop shop. They're only like responsible for maybe like this one sensor or this one controller, and they'll just drop a 5G connection on the network, and they won't even think anything of it. And so if you're not looking for them, right, and you don't know they're there, essentially there's this internet connection now on your network, and you have consultants coming in and out. Hopefully, just the consultants, yeah, right. But who else is using that connection to access the network? So
Of
yeah,
course.
those you see those all the time, unfortunately.
Do you think that that would be something that would show up on Shodan? Like if you had that pop up, do you think that you'd actually see it?
Yeah, the that's a great question because you think, oh well, yeah, if I look, so with Shodan, it has to have a public IP address exposed, and then right, you have to have some type of port or service exposed that you can actually connect to. So the vast majority of these that I've actually got to see, from what I've seen, they don't have anything externally exposed, which is the saving grace.
Well, that's good.
So
At least there's
that's
that.
right. Now I've heard some horror stories, and we also had a client that they essentially set up two of these one time to create a bridge. It was, let's just say, a massive factory in North America, massive factory, probably one of the largest in the country, and they're trying to bridge a river essentially, and instead of they used to have fiber runs, apparently something broke or whatever, and so they're like, okay, we'll just spin up wireless modems, and the ones that they had spun up actually on 5G actually did have ports that were were exposed, and you could essentially pretty easily connect to both sides of their OT network. Yeah, it wasn't pretty. When I showed them that, they were like, "Oh, okay, yes, we probably should do something about that." And there's a couple of known vendors out there that are pretty of this type of equipment that are really bad, and that you
Mm.
can find those on Shodan, and unfortunately.
Yeah, it's always interesting when you run Shodan and you find internal IP cameras, internal, sometimes even access control systems or all
Hmm.
kinds of stuff that are just hooked up to the internet. And you're like, oh, okay.
For sure. Yeah, and then there's always that question, like if you compromise them, right? Because they're usually Linux based. usually fairly easy to compromise. And it's a question of, is it on the IT network? Is it on the OT network? Right? Or is it on some isolated network, which it never it never is, right? It's, it's like probably 70% of the time it's sitting on the IT network. So it's like, okay, from an OT perspective, I'm not as concerned, um, but a lot of times they pop up on the OT network. Yeah, and I've seen those. Sometimes you have like a, if you like, I've seen this, but thankfully we caught it. Had a client. Right, it's very common when somebody goes to build a new list. You're going to build a factory. Someone first thing they do is they level the dirt and then they just plop out a web camera because they want to watch as you build this thing over multiple years, and then you can create a really cool video of time lapse to see. And right, that's cool. I get it. But then like over time, oh, we have this internet connection. We have like an IT and we have an OT network, and then that camera gets put on the OT network, and it's always been exposed to the internet. So now you have this camera on the OT network exposed to the internet. So if somebody compromised it, they have a foothold on the OT network. So I've seen that
That's
happen.
that's actually a really interesting attack vector. I've never thought of using that camera, but you're right.
Right.
I've seen that exact thing happen. So okay,
Yeah,
so
for sure.
right off the bat, there's going to be a lot of people out there who have done some level of IT pen testing or some derivative, and they've never put their
Yeah.
toe into the OT environment. So
Yeah.
you are the guy to ask for this. But what is
Well,
the
I
difference
appreciate
between
that.
IT and OT, security or pen testing
Yeah,
or
no, I appreciate
environments?
that. I'm not, but but thank you. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One of those. So for folks that have been doing IT pen testing, the interesting thing is most when people buy OT pen tests today, they are actually realistically essentially buying an IT pen test, believe it or not. Meaning you'll never touch a OT or an ICS asset in any of these engagements, because what they want is you're going to come in, they're usually doing an assumed breach scenario, right? So we're going to give you access to the IT network and say, hey, can you get into the OT network? Or usually, in especially medium, large size environments, you'll have a DMZ that sits between IT and OT. And so they might be like, can you get onto one of the machines in the IT OT DMZ? And
Right.
the kicker is, right, those are all almost always Windows machines, right? You're not talking, there's no OT assets, right? You're not talking about like programmable logic controllers and human machine interfaces, right? PLCs and HMIs. It's Windows machines. So you're
Mm,
really just going from Windows machines and IT to the Windows machine sitting in that IT OT DMZ. Or
right.
they might say, can you get that foothold in the OT environment? And I think a lot of people don't realize, and I didn't realize this till I stepped foot on my, on my first project, which was a massive power plant, was there's windows everywhere in OT, right? And it's all Windows servers and it's all workstations and laptops. And so you're really just going from Windows machine to Windows machine to Windows machine. And yeah, there's some Linux in there, but it's Linux is much more rare in the OT world than it is in the IT world. So you're really just going from Windows to Windows. So the majority, like literally the majority, even if you go to like the big OT pen test firms,
Mm,
right, and there's very few like Dragos and a few others,
mm.
the vast majority of the OT pen tests that they do, they're just going Windows machine to Windows machine to Windows machine. They are just doing IT pen testing, believe it or not. Um, Now, when you get into, and this is the course that I put on YouTube, it's like, well, we get that, and there's two books out there for pen testing, and the later one, and I love the guy that wrote it, but it focuses on a lot of the Windows stuff, and I'm like, man, there's just so many courses and so many books and so many YouTube videos, on how to break into Windows machines, and
Sure.
do web application pen testing, because we have web interfaces now everywhere in OT. So it's like, how do we really pen test true OT or control system assets, the PLCs, the HMIs, the DCS and SIS, basically the ultimate safety system, right? That would be responsible for shutting down the facility, or at least part of a facility if there's some type of fault condition that you, somebody could get hurt, there could be an explosion, those types of things. So it's like, what does that testing look like? So then when you also think, well, the vast majority of the time we don't test those in production, right? Because we're worried about safety, or we're worried about bringing down the plant, right? And so since you're worried about those, we always say, well, we're only testing in test environments, right? Or in some type of lab, maybe where we can do a simulation. Virtual environments are kind of getting there. I think we still have a ways to go, but I think in a couple years, at the most, I think we'll be there. But so yeah, so because of all those things, again, the vast majority of OT pen tests, they're really IT pen tests. And then you can actually then get into, and this is what I focus on in the course I'm doing now is, okay, what do I do with a PLC and this HMI thing? And how do I understand and how do I learn once I connect to one of those? Like, well, what does it control out in the real world is really what we have to figure out.
Right.
And then ultimately, how is this control system actually programmed? So that way I can manipulate it to have that impact in the real world.
So, okay, so that's interesting because I would have thought that it would all been Linux machines. So the fact that it's mostly it's mostly Windows machines is kind of fascinating. So, given that you said that there's web apps kind of everywhere, for
Yeah.
people who are wanting to get into this, and obviously the first step of getting into this would be take your course, but for people who are wanting to get into this, would you recommend then like Windows Active Directory kind of knowledge or more
Oh,
web
for
app
sure.
knowledge?
So I would always say, just like in IT, you want to start with those fundamentals. So everything from the networking perspective, even from like an attack perspective, right? Because you can compromise network infrastructure, you have control over everything, right? And so networking, and then Windows is definitely that huge. Active Directory. When I mentioned that, when I went on site for my first project, it was like 2012. It was this massive power plant, and the plant manager was going to do a tour, and he was really excited to show me like their new firewalls and everything that they had, and they were just about to go. They had one line up and running, so about a third of the facility was actually running, and they would go into the control room, and he shows me the data center, and he shows me all the infrastructure, and he's like, here's our Active Directory domain controllers, and I was like, what? I was like, Active Directory. I was like, well, crap, I know like 50 million ways to take control over that and use that, right, to take control over the entire network. I'm like, really? And then they start talking about, well, and here's our data historians. And for folks that aren't familiar with data historians, they essentially are databases that record telemetry essentially for everything that happens in the environment. So in the power plant, right, turbine spinning, right, we have to make sure it goes right. It's not too fast, not too slow, it's not overheating, those types of things. So that's all recorded in this database. Well, that database, it's just SQL Server sitting on a Windows server, whatever version at the time. And so like, well, shoot, I know, like 50 different ways to break into that thing. And the list just goes on and on. But those were a few of the big ones that as we were talking, my eyes were just huge because it was like there's just windows everywhere. And in a lot of OT environments, no, they don't get patched, right? Because they are worried about, something goes down, it could be an impact to safety or availability, even though you should be patching, Windows systems in OT pretty much as often as you are in IT, making sure, of course, you have backups and redundant systems. But yeah, so and that's why it kind of goes back to yeah, if you do IT pen testing today, you're right, you have so much of a basis, right? And you can understand at least how to get into the OT network. And then you can talk about like web app. I'm okay doing web app pen test. Like I'm not horrible at it. It's not my favorite thing to do. right. But definitely I'm okay at it. Um, but yeah, you'll see web interfaces pretty much just about on a lot different machines. The Russians had um this is 2023. I'm trying to keep track of time in my head, but 2023, the Russians had gone in and this is where they created another blackout in the Ukraine. So they did this in
Mm,
2015, 2016, but back then they created ICS specific malware, kind of like like sexing it away, right? You spend time, a
mm,
lot of money. In this case, they just used a living off the land, right? They just went Windows machine to Windows machine to Windows machine
mm,
to where they found a web interface for a SCADA manager interface. SCADA is just another type of ICS or OT, and they basically used basically kind of brute force the thing until they figured out what the password was, and then they logged in and had full control just to the interface to flip the power breakers off.
mm.
And then in true Russian fashion, as they always do, then they go back and they just wipe all the machines. So you literally have nothing to even restore service other than people literally, going out in the field and manually flipping those breakers, which actually is a really dangerous job. Um,
Mm,
so yeah, it's kind of this living off the land. Yeah, web app attacks, uh, you know, definitely play true today. Even human machine interfaces, right? You have a GUI that allows you to see what's going on and that's a part of the environment. And then that these days is driven, it's just a web page, right? And so that web page could have vulnerabilities. It's sitting on a web server. That web server could have vulnerabilities, right? That web server sitting on an operating system, that operating system could have vulnerabilities. So it's just this ongoing ongoing cycle. And when you start getting into those OT assets like HMIs and PLCs, they themselves, they don't get patched that often.
uh,
And then you
in-
start looking at, finding these on the internet, right? And
right.
especially ones that have their web interfaces, they get it indexed by Google. You don't even need Shodan. You can use Google to find some of these.
Mm.
And, you find some and, oh, here's a PLC that hasn't been updated since 2006, those types of things. So
So would you say then that because most of these systems are not getting updated, fundamentally, are you saying that pretty much anyone who has hacking chops who gets onto this network can probably do some really nefarious things to most systems?
well, it's a good, you start to think, and then there's a couple of, I guess, big asterisks or exceptions there. Because when you start thinking of, okay, I'm on the OT network and I have access to all these Windows machines. Maybe I have control over all the Windows machines on the OT network, right? I've got your Active Directory, I've got all your usernames and passwords and hashes and service accounts, and I have access to all the data in your data historian. But where you get to is ultimately, let's say I have a power plant as an example, that let's say I wanted to create a blackout. And right, most common scenario from a military perspective is, right, we want you to take out this power plant because it powers this military base, right? We want that military base to go offline because it has, I don't know, anti-aircraft missiles that they want to take offline. They don't even think, right, it powers a civilian population at the same time. They just want that military base to go offline. But if I have a power plant, right, and I want to create I want to take the power plant offline,
Mm,
just because you have that foothold in the environment, that's the easy part, right? Because that's just
mm,
the IT pen test, and not to
right.
make light of IT pen testing, but
Mm,
that's really all the easy stuff up till that point. Because once you're on the
mm,
network, then you have to figure out, well, where are the different control
right.
systems, right? What are those control systems? How are they related, right? What controls what as far as the systems? And then you have to figure out from over the wire, like, well, this system, how, what is controlling that turbine, right? What's
Mm,
controlling this combustion chamber that generates heat to create steam to turn
right.
the turbine? right, those types of things. And so you have to be able to figure out all of this information remotely. And so that takes a lot of time to reverse
Mm,
engineer. And so that's why you'll see like Volt Typhoon, right? The Chinese threat
mm,
actors, where Volt Typhoon is a very large group and they're very good and very quick at right getting into IT environments and moving into OT and finding out everything about the OT network as far as what's on there, especially the Windows machines. And they're very good at stealing specific information to describe the environment. So finding, programming code, right? How are those systems programmed? GIS data, which talks like about the geographic location, how the plan is laid out. So you can use that as well to understand, right, how to reverse engineer the network. But then they get that initial access, and then they'll hand off that initial access to a group, essentially a group of cybersecurity slash engineers they have that knowledge to be able to reverse engineer the process of that facility, understand how it's built, right? And then they can determine, okay, if I change the code over here, then I can create the blackout. Or if it's a petrochemical refinery, right? This is how I could create an explosion. Or if this is a railway, this is how I could make a train derail as it's going around a corner, this curve, those types of things. So yeah, it's very hard though, and I think the people that can actually do that in critical infrastructure, right, at that size and that scope, those people, thankfully, right, are very few and far between. But at the same time, like in my OT pen testing course, that's really again kind of the focus is, well, how do we walk through that process? So we start with a simple example of an air conditioning unit, right, and manipulating the thermostat because to be able to, can I turn the air conditioner on and off? Can I do it on a permanent basis? Could I potentially break down that air conditioner over time, just like those
mm.
centrifuges in
Sure.
Iran? Right. So part of it is, and I know I talk a lot. I should have warned you, but
No, that's
uh,
good.
but it does come down to what ultimately the mission is, right? And that doesn't matter if you're a state adversary or you're a hacktivist or a ransomware operator, right? What's the mission? And then how you're going to achieve that. And a lot of that for, of course, state adversaries, right? They want to be in a position to have an impact, like create a blackout to take that military base offline. Not that they wouldn't at least have gas generators for a while, at least I would think. But okay, you know, but yeah, it's what's the mission? How do we accomplish it? And then ultimately, if it is about impacting that physical process in the real world, that's where you're reverse engineering, and that takes time.
Interesting. So you had mentioned that okay, so you mentioned that a lot of the PLCs and things, they don't get patched. They're running on legacy code, which means they're hyper vulnerable to a whole bunch of stuff. Um, there's a lot of systems that you can get into, and getting into the system is the easy part. The hard part is mapping out and figuring out what does what. But I guess one question that I have is, and I hear this a lot, is why don't we see power plants, catching fire and trains derailing? And why don't we see this kind of catastrophic thing happen more? Is it because the defense is too good? Is it because the threat actors are too bad? Is it because that's not their goal in their mission? Like, why don't we see this?
Yeah, I wish we could say defense was great, but yeah, defense and OT is like IT was 10, 15 years ago. There's still so many environments today that are just starting their OT cyber programs. And really the majority of OT environments out there are so small that they'll never have the resources to actually do anything, right? They don't have somebody
Hmm.
for IT cyber. They don't have somebody for OT. They don't even have anybody for IT cyber, let alone IT. Right, they'll call somebody in on a like case by case basis if something happens. So yeah, unfortunately, defense is not there. Uh, yeah, it's when you think of what we really see today is it's interesting, kind of this place we're at today. And I've of course been tracking the threat landscape since 2010, basically. But where we're at today is we've seen an increase of known state adversary, right, attacks, and a lot of that revolves around the known conflicts that we have, especially primarily Russia and Ukraine. There's a lot of hacktivist activity around that as well. Russia, Ukraine. I actually love watching the Ukrainians actually fighting back, which I think really is awesome. And it's like, yeah, good for you. Israel, Iran, those are probably the bigger areas where we see a lot of hacktivist activity. And then you have the ransomware operators or cyber criminals, and some of these, right, they're more advanced than some state adversaries at times, right? But they're there only to make money, right? They're not worried about trying to blow up the power plant. They're like, hey, you don't pay us, your manufacturing plant is going to go down, and it costs you $10 million a day, when your factory's down. Hey, we want, I don't know, $200,000. And those environments, they'll probably be like, here, take our money, right? Please. Um, so yeah, it depends on the attackers, right? What they're after. Um, it's really interesting that, sometimes it's, why haven't we seen more explosions and bad things? Yeah, and sometimes people use that as an excuse, which drives me crazy. Like there's especially there's the older folks that have been in OT and OT cybersecurity since the field was really started. And they ask like, or kind of, it's like the stance of, we don't need to do anything more for OT cyber today because nobody's been hurt or killed. I'm like,
Right.
well, I mean, people have died because of cyber attacks in IT and OT, but also that shouldn't be a reason for us not to, let's put a firewall between IT and
Right.
OT, right?
Yeah.
Let's make sure we deploy network security monitoring, and we're watching for an attacker that gets on the network, and those types of things. So let's not use that as an excuse to not protect our environments, right? And prevent the bad things from happening. I think a big problem though, and this is interesting. I've had these discussions with some of the the big thought leaders in OT cybersecurity, some owners and operators in some of these large environments, is if you had an explosion, and I can share this. This is something that Rob Lee had shared at Besides ICS this year. He did our keynote, and we actually did a fireside chat afterwards. But it kind of goes to, if you had an explosion in a facility, how would you know if it was a cyber attack or not? The vast majority of environments today, you have no idea. You can't do the root cause analysis. You don't have the tools. About 5% of environments globally in OT are actually doing network security monitoring.
Wow.
And I would say even probably half of those are probably doing a really bad job, because some of them will be like, oh, we have, Dragos or Nozomi or whatever. We have their sensor deployed at this, we have them deployed. And it's like,
Mm.
yeah, but you have 100 different refineries and you only have them deployed at one place. Oh, well, we have them deployed, you know?
Wow.
And so, yeah, so nobody's watching. It's very rare for people to be watching the OT network. So this goes back to the Rob story he was mentioning, and to kind of go back in 2017, we had the Trisis incident, or
Okay.
Triton, depending on who you talk to.
Right.
This is where the Russian adversary group known as Sandworm, the
Mhm.
most prolific, most public, right, impact in OT, right? They're the ones that were responsible for the Ukrainian blackouts in
Right.
2015, 2016, 2023, and many other things.
Mm.
Had got into a petrochemical facility owned and operated by Saudi Aramco in the Middle East.
Mm.
Complete control over the OT network, including the SIS, the safety instrumented system. And Rob always stresses the only reason somebody would take control over the SIS is to kill somebody.
Wow.
because they're going to cause an explosion at that petrochemical facility and people are going to die. And they had made a small programming error, and that caused the SIS to trip. And that's how the owners, operators realized, well, that's not something it should do. Obviously not good. And then it's like calling the vendor. Vendor's like, uh, this isn't us. This is somebody's tampered with this. And then they call in, the Aramco folks and then Mandiant and Dragos so they figured that out. Thankfully, right? No harm to the environment, no harm to people. Last year, there was an explosion at a refinery in the United States.
Okay.
Now, Rob shared this again in the keynote. He said, and Dragos, for those aren't familiar, I should say, Rob, he is the CEO, co-founder of Dragos. He worked at the NSA for years, and he built out the program that monitored for state adversaries or any attackers, right? Targeting OT, really state adversaries back then, right? He also was a red teamer, right? He was breaking into OT environments and had the ability to create a blackout, right, by taking a power plant off, like that type of thing. And so he said that with Dragos, and a big thing of what they're doing, they're still watching today, just like with the NSA, and they had watched Sandworm, right? So the same team that had compromised this petrochemical facility back in 2017, the same group, they say they were trying to get into this petrochemical facility for 6 weeks, just pounding away, trying to get in. And then all of a sudden there's an explosion. The CEO came out and said, well, the explosion was caused because the safety instrumented system, the SIS, tripped. Like, well, that's what happened in Trisis, right? Just no explosion. And then they said, well, there's no in this instance last year, well, there's no sign of cyber attack.
Right.
Well, remember, what is nobody doing in OT?
Yeah.
Nobody's monitoring it, and they weren't either. So they're saying there's no sign of cyber attack, but they couldn't tell you because they weren't doing monitoring. So there could that have been a cyber attack? There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that would say yes, it is. And then at the same time, there's no definitive proof. And that's, I think, a big part of the puzzle, right? Is we just don't know. You can't do that root cause analysis because people aren't watching.
So when you're saying that people aren't monitoring, I assume like most things, it's because of a money issue. Like they just
Yeah,
can't afford to monitor all these things.
yeah,
But
absolutely.
are you saying that if hackers attempt to penetrate a power plant or a wind turbine or a substation or whatever, that the owners of the owners of those products, they wouldn't be able to track who did it, or even if that it was a cyber attack?
If they're not doing the monitoring, it in most cases, probably not. No,
Wow. Wow.
no,
Okay.
because a lot of it, because if anything, let's say we had an explosion, or let's just say even maybe people always get crazy when you use explosions because they say you're trying to do, the
Right.
fear and uncertainty doubt thing. But okay, a manufacturing plant goes offline, right? A conveyor belt goes offline
Right.
for 12 hours,
Right.
you know, and we don't have network security monitoring. We don't have anything like host based in the environment either. So what would we look at? So we can look at our data historian, right? And we can see like telemetry data, right? How the environment's been operating. Um, could there be, clues there? Sure. A lot of those clues, I think a lot of times would probably just look like noise, or it could just look like just normal little, differences in how the environment works. So I think in a lot of cases, would you really be able to tell if you went back through that data? I think in some cases for sure. And I think in other cases you probably never would. And then, there's probably everything in between too.
Sure. That makes perfect sense.
But then you have to have somebody to be able to do that, which also requires that's an engineer, right? So you have to have
Right.
somebody that's not only an engineer, but then they understand like the forensic
Yeah.
aspect, right? And finding somebody like that is extremely rare. I mean, there's less than, 100 people in the world that can do that type of work today.
Interesting.
And I know a
So
few of them, so
I'm sure you do.
but yeah, they'll tell you, yeah, it's just, yeah, it's very rare. So that's another part of the puzzle. Yeah. So with not,
Interesting.
yeah.
So keeping in kind of the genre of monitoring, one thing that I get pushback on a lot is, so I've been asked to run around Europe quite a bit lately, looking at substations and looking at
Right.
it from a physical security side of things, which basically there are none. It's usually just a chain link fence with nothing else. Uh,
Right, for sure.
but hey, it's the best chain link fence money can buy, right?
Right.
But my question is, the one pushback that I typically get from the owners of these things is that if a substation, which is usually air and oil cooled, if that coolant leaks out or is destroyed or something and the temperature starts to rise, well, the engineers would notice it and shut it off before it boiled over, destroyed. And my question
Yeah.
is that BS or is that true from your perspective?
It's one of those it depends questions, right? Because you think like in those environments, like a substation, right? Or any OT environment, any aspect of OT environment, the whole point of control systems, and this is why, people used to use the term SCADA, right? And SCADA stands for supervisory control and data acquisition, right? The whole point of control systems is you're monitoring what's going on in the environment, and then you have the system that's able to take action, for you to make adjustments. And then if, hey, we're not getting the job done and we need humans to help, right, we'll send up an alert.
Right.
The problem with that is that control system, that it has to be programmed. And it has to be programmed, right, by a human.
Hmm.
We humans, right, we all make mistakes,
Sure.
right? And did we plan for every type of scenario to go wrong? And I can tell you a lot, they don't. Um, so I've seen some really big misses in some environments. Like we've had, and this is, we'll take over work for like one company, and they're like, okay, well, here's, the initial design we had, and here's the programming we had for this control system. And like I mean, you would just allow an attacker to get right straight into your OT environment from IT without even
Hmm.
thinking about like, oh, well, that's because the plant manager is going to sit in the IT network, right? And they need to still access like stuff like that, right? And then you just get into the programming of the control systems, and it's like, yeah, they barely did enough code to get it up and running. So it's like a
Mm.
substation, right? It's like, let's
Right.
make sure, yeah, we bring in massive, large amounts of power from the power station, and then break it down into safe amounts that we can push out to people's houses and offices.
Right.
And yeah, so they don't put a lot of logic. I actually built a couple scenarios into my course, like with I think with the simple air conditioning unit. But again, I
Mhm.
love it because it's a great one to start with,
Sure.
because do I have the ability, if I'm on the system, and we haven't even touched on the worst thing about control systems from a security perspective, but if I can gain access to that control system, okay, sure, okay, I can turn the air conditioner off, or, well, can I turn it, what if I can turn it to like 16,000 degrees, something like that. Now, right, that might potentially like break a heater or air conditioner over time, right, or just
Mm.
cause some type of issue. But just the fact that it allowed me to do that because the
Right.
programmer or the developer forgot to do that,
Right.
right? So much of that happens, right? I've seen, what if you have like a piece of equipment that is in a cabinet, that cabinet all of a sudden, um, like over time, all the vents just got clogged up with dust.
Sure.
And so then that piece of equipment starts overheating.
Mm.
And so there was this system that the PLC that would go out and talk with, it would control the system in this cabinet. it realized, hey, you're overheating. So it would just start talking to it. Basically say, hey, are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay?
Right.
But there was no alert to tell the operator what was going on. So they only found out after the equipment failed. And then they went back and they actually had basically a SOC. And they were saying, oh yeah, this PLC just started like asking like this equipment like really fast, like what's your status? What's your status? But they didn't see it as an attack. And so they didn't take any action. So and that's and
Yeah.
that's and in OT, right? Actually, the SOC really is to they're really first and foremost to find those types of issues that you can actually fix with things like preventative maintenance, right? Or at least proactive maintenance, right? To get in there and fix it, right? Because you're finding those types of issues 99.9% of the time, right?
Hmm.
It's only that 0.1 or less that it's actually a cyber attack.
Right. Yeah,
But
that makes
yeah,
sense.
you see a lot of that. So
Okay, so you hinted that we hadn't talked about the worst
oh,
aspect of
yeah,
security. So that begs the question: what is the worst aspect of security breaches or security issues?
right? Because we talked, yeah, like, oh, there's Windows everywhere. I could take care of, all the Windows machines and Active Directory, and there's vulnerabilities everywhere. Um, with a lot of these systems, especially the PLCs, which is the main OT asset that we see deployed, right? That's what's physically wired into these systems we're moving out in the real world. I always use going back to the air conditioning unit example, right? Think your thermostat is a PLC, right? Because it physically has a wire from itself to the air conditioning unit. So when we need to turn the air conditioner on, right, it gets too warm, we send a signal, air conditioner comes on, right?
Right.
Room gets back to where it should be, send another signal. My air conditioner just clicked on, right? And then sends a signal, right? Turns the air conditioner off, right? So those PLCs, right, they actually run protocols or exposed services. So most of these, of course, they were written 20, 30 years ago where no one was thinking of security. So the most common one we see is Modbus. And Modbus is unauthenticated. So it means you can connect to it and it doesn't ask you for a username or a password. And you can just sit there and issue any command that it can understand.
Right.
And so a lot of it really comes down to it has its own table of values. So like with the thermostat example, right, you would say, hey, I want the room to be 72 degrees. So if you were to look into the table, you would see some value label and you would see, oh, 72. But with Modbus, right, you can connect over the network and then you can change 72 to 71. Or like I mentioned earlier, could I change it to 16,000?
Right.
Right. Now, it shouldn't allow you to change it to 16,000, but again, that's another one. Was it programmed, right? It's just like any program, right? You put all those like kind of the error checking and those different conditions and
Right.
kind of boundaries in place to protect the program and the system and the process.
Right. Yeah.
And again, I don't, a lot of the developers, they're just not going to get everything. And I get it. I know I wouldn't, you know? So, so yeah, so the worst thing is because once you're on the network in OT, yeah, it's, oh, I found this PLC and then I can connect to it and read those values. And this goes back to kind of where we are talking about earlier. It's like, okay, well, what is this thing actually connected to, right? I might know, oh, I'm in a power plant, right? But what is this PLC connected to? There could be, tens or twenties, or if it's a manufacturing facility, right? Is this PLC connected to like a side client that in the Carolinas, right? It could be a silo where they release sawdust as part of their process, or it could be driving their conveyor belt, or one could be driving their robotic arm, right? That picks up 500-pound trays and shifts them over, right? At first, you don't know. And that's the hard part in OT is when you get in the network, you might know, okay, it's a power plant or a manufacturing facility, but then, okay, you found a PLC, you don't know what it's connected to.
Right.
So
Okay.
that's where you have to start looking the environment and then start reverse engineering with what you can find. So files, right? Diagrams that you're finding on different servers and workstations. So that's where all the Windows skills, right, come in handy, right? Or if you find one of those HMIs, right, it's a GUI, right? And so, oh, you can see what's going on in the environment. If you can line that up with those values that you're seeing in that table, right? That's kind of like the Rosetta Stone a lot of the times, right? Maybe there's the data on the data historian, right? Because that data, it's just coming from those tables. So you can take, all those things to put the puzzle together, but it definitely takes time.
Interesting. So that begs the question, for mostly for my audience, but what is the worst physical security aspect of OT environments in your opinion? So like the biggest like kind of vulnerability you would think, or the worst place to get to, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, well, a couple. I mean, probably just the biggest thing is, I think you've probably seen it everywhere. It's the typical, right? You walk around with a hard hat and a clipboard, you can get in pretty much anywhere, right? I used to think, and some sites are better than others. Like, like I said, I work with some of the largest companies in the world, and like you try to show up at the Shell site,
Mhm.
they're on lockdown, So for you to try to slip in there, right? It's not going to happen.
Sure.
Um, I would be really surprised because it's not, hey, okay, you got a hard hat and you have all the PP, your personal protection equipment. Okay,
Right.
you look the right, you even have maybe a badge that looks real, like okay, you
Mhm.
look the part, but they will definitely track you down. Um, Whereas, a lot of other places is, yeah, you can just walk around. And I've been to a lot of large sites where they're just so large. I mean, they're small
Mhm.
cities,
Right.
and
Sure.
they have the chain link fence, but so many of them, they like go over a drainage ditch where I've seen some drainage ditches that they're like 8 feet tall. I could just like literally walk under the fence. I don't have to duck, stuff like that. Right. And nobody would ever see. And yeah, sure, there's some CCTV, but would they see you?
Yeah.
Probably not. So yeah, perimeter security a lot of in times is unfortunately a joke.
Mhm.
Of course, we have some facilities, right? There's the seismic sensors, and so it's like good luck trying to break in, to
Sure.
those. But in general, yeah, it's perimeter security is horrible. When you look at, once you're inside the perimeter, nobody's usually asking questions. Again, larger, more mature environments are better at that for sure. Um, but then once you're there, it doesn't take too long where, I mean, you don't even have to get into a building to find potentially a network access point like an RJ45, open jack to be able to plug into, right? You can potentially find someone or one out in amongst all the piping and all the equipment. Of course, the problem with that is that's a dangerous job. So,
Sure.
your head's always on a swivel in these. So I don't suggest that if you're doing a pen test. I would say, try to do more of a physical pen test in the buildings sections. I always try like find the control room, right? The data center is usually, very close, if not next to the control room. And then usually there's also all the engineering workstations and laptops. Those are what the engineers will use to program the PLCs and do things like firmware updates and restorations. And so a lot of the sensitive files that you would be looking for as an attacker and the capability, they're sitting on those engineering workstations. So
Mm.
those types of things. So, but yeah, it's kind of the typical, yeah. If you look the part and you act the part, you can pretty much get into anywhere in most environment. I'm sure. I mean, you've you've probably done, affiliate assessments. I'm sure.
I've done a few. Yeah, I've done a few. So, okay, so here's a question for you. I know that, these types of environments are not supposed to be connected to the internet in any way, shape, or form.
Of
But
course
every
not.
once in a while, but every once in a while, you'll see some of them that are running some type of local Wi-Fi for something.
Mhm.
And my question is that something that we've screwed around with from time to time is basically putting a Wi-Fi access point on the top of a drone and then flying the drone
Mhm.
over, then to connect back to
Yep.
extend the signal.
Yep.
How
Absolutely.
dangerous would that potentially be to an OT environment, if
I
at
mean,
all?
definitely, yeah. There's always risk. I was actually thinking of the Wi-Fi thing. When I was answering the last one, because we were talking about physical security, because I there was a super large facility I went to. Again, size of a small city, and it was in the, I always say, the middle of nowhere, because I'll always go and I look up where's the nearest Starbucks to see like how far am I from civilization, right? And the nearest, this one actually wasn't horrible. It was like the nearest Starbucks was 300 miles away, so not too bad, but still, right? And their Wi-Fi access was actually wide open. And I was like,
Mm,
all right, we need, like, we had a site there, and of course ours are super locked down, but the client's Wi-Fi on the OT network was wide open. And I was
interesting.
like, let's fix this, right? This is why this is bad. And the guy basically was like, well, we're out in the middle of nowhere. Nobody's gonna come out here to attack us. Like, oh yeah, they will, right? You're surrounded, but they could just sit out in those trees. You'll never know they're there,
Right.
and they'll just jump on your Wi-Fi. So we did get that fixed. But you know, to answer your question, that is, I wouldn't worry about it if you were doing just the IT network. But
Mm,
that's when you get into OT and the OT network, that's just where you just never know. And that's
right.
where, sure, probably 99% of the time, you're not going to cause a safety issue, right? 98% of the time, you're probably not going to cause an availability issue. But if there's ever a chance that somebody gets hurt or somebody gets died, it gets killed, do you really want to take that chance to do a pen test? No, of course not.
Right.
Obviously, state adversaries, hacktivists, ransomware operators, etc., they don't care, right? I don't
Right.
usually. I mean, some ransom operators say, "Hey, we're not going to target this type of environment, right? We don't want to kill anybody." Like, all right, good on you, but but yeah, it's whenever there's a question, and that's why I mean, I get a lot of requests for like OT pen test, targeting PLCs, HMIs, DCI, like all of them in production and in large production
Wow.
environments, in my outside consulting work. And I'm like, I would love, I mean, if you took safety out of the equation, right, I would love to. It would be the funnest job in the world. But at the end of the day, right, if there's ever a
Mhm.
question of safety, right, or
Yeah.
availability, right, then it's like, okay, maybe if you say like, we'll make sure everybody's out of the facility, and it's not like a petrochemical facility, right? Maybe it's like manufacturing, and you waive, liability, so you're not going to hold me responsible. Okay, then I'll do it, right? But yeah.
So have you had clients not really understand the potential risk and ask you to do things that you're like, no, I'm not going to do that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And mostly in my outside consulting work. So in the day job, like I said, I work with a lot of the more, some of the most mature OT programs in the world, right? So we don't even have to have those conversations about why this is a bad
Oh,
idea,
it's good.
um, which is nice. Yeah, not all of them, not all of them. So there I still do have those conversations in the day job, but yeah, usually it's in the kind of the side. But one was, it was a $500 million manufacturing facility, right? So that's, not small in any stretch of the imagination. And yeah, they want it. It reminds me of, and I'm sure you can appreciate, it's just like, I know when I was doing IT pen testing, right? I know you would always get a call from a client. They say, "Oh, we need an IT pen test." Like, okay, great, awesome, I can help you with that. And it's like, well, what are your goals, right? What are you trying to accomplish? Like, well, we just started to do something about cybersecurity, right? It's like, oh, well, you don't need you don't need an IT pen test. Like, you need a maturity assessment. Let's start with a vulnerability assessment, right? Those types of things. And that's where the OT world is today, right? The vast majority, they'll call and say, hey, or I get pinged on LinkedIn, right? It's like, hey, we need an IT pen test. And it's like, okay, well, what are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? Like, oh, we're just starting our, program, or like our boss said, we need a pen test, and it's like, well, all right, let's take a step back. You need a maturity assessment, right? You need a risk assessment.
Yeah.
Let's understand the gaps in your program. And I mean, again, I love pen testing, right? I have a lot of good friends that are pen testers, but pen testing, right, for a client perspective, it's expensive. And will it reduce your risk? Sure, but will it reduce your risk as much as putting a firewall between IT and OT? No, of course not.
Right.
Right. So it's going to be more expensive, and it's not going to reduce your risk as much as that firewall. So let's help you understand where to start and mature. And then over time, when you get to the point, then we can talk about doing a pen test, but then also
It's
defining what that looks like.
it's hilarious that you say that, because that's exactly what I experience in physical pen testing all the time with clients who say things like, well, we need physical pen testing. And you look at their building and you talk to them and you're like, you need an audit. You need an audit.
Right.
You're not ready for a pen test. And it's trying to explain to people, it's like, look, buddy, if I told you that I ran a web app, company, and I said, I want a pen test, but I don't think you're going to get inside because we're running the latest, greatest patched version of Windows 7. It's like, okay, you don't need a pen
Right.
test, buddy. It's okay.
Right. And and sadly, right, there are a lot of people out there still that will take advantage of those people and be like, sure, right, I'll sell you a pen. And then they give the rest of everybody else, a bad name, unfortunately.
Yes.
Like, and
That.
it just drives me crazy.
Oh,
So
yeah. No, I'm right there with you. But that actually begs the question. In the OT environment,
yeah.
what are your clients the most concerned about? Like, what is it that they're like, okay, this is why we want to hire you. Like, this is why we're reaching out to you.
Yeah. So from and this, I always hate answering this question because we always say, right, safety's first,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of times, though, that doesn't factor in a lot of the conversations, only because in these environments, safety really is ingrained in everything. So, and that's handled, right. There's entire teams dedicated to ensuring the safety of personnel on these sites.
Right.
So it's almost like it's this understated, right, requirement. So it's like we don't really, when you're in these large environments, you don't really talk about safety as the number one requirement because you already know it's the number one requirement. So when you're having those conversations, it really starts around availability. The
Okay.
interesting thing is, right, because a lot of environments, and it's still fascinating, that if you go even to a manufacturing site or a power plant, right, a water treatment facility, it doesn't matter. You have an IT network, you have an OT network.
Mm.
The one that generates the revenue is the OT network, right? If I have a power plant, I make money because I'm generating power. That's the OT network,
Right.
right? The IT network, it processes the bills, right? It pays for the resources to generate the power. I'm not trying to
Right.
diminish IT. I'm just saying, right, the where the business actually operates and generates revenue from, that's the OT side. But it's to where all the focus and resources go to IT, right? And I think we're
Yeah.
starting to see that shift a little bit, but it's a really slow shift. So a lot of people don't realize yet we need this stronger focus on the OT side of the house, and they need budget, they need resources
Yeah.
to protect it because, and this kind of goes, we touched on it a little bit earlier with the, like, if I actually had a SOC, again, like we mentioned, very few environments are doing monitoring. But if you were, and I think this is a great selling point to get SOCs in these environments, is that there's so many types of issues that you can detect and prevent if you were watching the network traffic in an OT environment. Like we are mentioning, like that piece of equipment in the cabinet that was overheating because the vents were clogged with dust. and the PLC just kept reaching down, just hitting it over and over and over again.
Right.
Somebody on the SOC should see that and be like, that doesn't look like normal activity, right?
Right.
Well, let me investigate. And it's really not their job to go out to the field to figure it out. They
Right.
call somebody that's responsible for plant operations, right? Let's
Right.
work with the PLC techs and the engineers and the other folks that work in the plant to figure out something's wrong. So let's
Right.
figure out what it is, right? And so yeah, it's all about availability. Again, safety first, but a
Right.
lot of it most of the conversations are, because again, everybody assumes safety is first. So everything else is really around availability, right? How do we make sure we keep the plan up? And that's, for me, the biggest sell is, hey, if you did things like network security monitoring, right, you can ensure, right, that you'll address the vast majority of your problems ahead of time before they become issues for you
Right.
if you just did this. I think the biggest problem, though, in a lot of these environments, I tell you, it doesn't matter how big or small they are, is, and I'll say, well, how much, if you were down for an hour, how much does that cost you? If you're down for 24 hours, how much does that cost you? And they used to, be very rare for somebody to tell me. They're like, oh, we don't know, or I have to find it. I thought they were just stonewalling me. Like they just didn't want to tell me, right, that it was top secret. Like, no, they literally didn't know. I'm like, if you don't know how much it's going to cost you for the environment to be down for like an hour, well, how can you have conversations of how much are we going to invest to protect the environment? And I've been in environments that, if they go down, it costs them $1,000 an hour. I've been in environments, it goes down, it costs them $100 million an hour,
Wow.
and everything in between, right? But if you can't answer that question, it doesn't matter what size, you don't know how much to invest. So if
Right.
it's, hey, you're going to lose $250,000 a day if you're down,
Hmm.
yeah, you know what? You might want to invest some resources in a SOC and monitoring to
But
help avoid the downtime.
now you're talking this is the quintessential problem with IT OT kind of security, where they'll be very tight on the purse strings and the budgets until something bad happens, and then all of a sudden the
Of course,
floodgates open.
right? Absolutely. And I was very, I jokingly say, like I actually created this little graphic that was happy anniversary for the Colonial Pipeline incident, which was 4 years ago, because it was the one incident that actually did wake up the OT world.
Mm.
And like it was like the target breach in IT, right? Because I remember before the target breach, right? The very few businesses were actually taking cybersecurity seriously. Even the army, I remember I had a friend at the army, right? That the army finally at that time were like, well, we probably should do something about this cyber thing. It's it was like, so Colonial Pipeline was like that. And the great thing was nobody died, right? But the United States' largest gasoline pipeline was taken offline for 10 days, right?
Right.
So there was an impact, and it was difficult at times to get gas if you were on the East Coast. So yeah, people started to pay attention. And so that was like that was the start of the swing. It wasn't the Ukrainian blackout in 2015 or 2016. It wasn't Trisis in 2017 when that safety controller tripped. It was Colonial Pipeline. But yeah, I think the next big step, it's something bad will have to happen either to these individual places to make them invest, right? Like you said, it's
Right.
just a very typical kind
Right.
of scenario, or something really, really public and really, really bad happens where multiple people die, and then, or there's some type of like massive pollution, right? To population center, and then people all of a sudden will be like, oh, we need to take OT cybersecurity more seriously. Of
Right.
course, I hope it doesn't come to that for sure.
Of course.
Chances are, though, and I hope I'm wrong, but chances are, I think it's it's just a matter of time.
All right. So I have on this note, I have a purely speculative question, and I'm just curious how you'll answer this.
Sure.
If the Iranians had have been doing monitoring to the level you think they should, would they have caught Stuxnet?
Yeah, they should have. I think. Well, I mean, I know at least. I mean, from my experience, and I'm people know I don't make a huge secret. I mean, I pretty follow anything that Rob Lee talks about because I mean, he was there with Mike Asante. Mike Asante, by many, is considered kind of the godfather of OT ICS cybersecurity, right? He's kind of one of the founders of the field. And Rob, I mean, again, he was at the NSA on both, red team, blue team, right? He built the program for tracking state adversaries in OT. I mean, the things he's seen, right? You can just, the stories, it's so when he says things, then I definitely pay attention, right? So with Stuxnet, it comes down to, so I've been very fortunate to take Rob wrote the grid course for SANS, and that's basically the network security detection and defense of OT networks, basically,
Okay.
course. And I love the course. Best course I still say I've ever taken because it does take what people think is a very complex, complicated subject like defending OT environments
Right.
and breaks it down and makes it simple and practical, which is what I always want to do
Mm.
because it doesn't have to be complex. And again, it doesn't matter if it's a $50 billion LNG port facility. It could be a $500,000 manufacturing facility and everything in between. The basics are the fun. It just doesn't change. So if you were doing network security monitoring and you understood your baseline, right, from a network perspective, you would see that looks very different. And you'd say, we need to investigate this.
Do you
But of
do
course,
you oh sorry, no, go ahead.
oh no, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, do you think that AI will help in any way with this? Do you think that AI will be brought in to like monitor these systems? Or do you think that that's
Yeah,
too much?
right. Yeah, we're still, of course, kind of seeing the beginnings of where AI is going to take OT environments, right? There's a lot of interesting work being done, like by like Idaho National Labs, right, in the U.S. They're kind of like the center of anything OT cyber, especially anything related to the grid, right, the power grid. So they're really focused on, not necessarily replacing human operators, but how can we, like, we have a team of people that watch over like the weather and how the weather impacts things like solar generation, right? Super cloudy day, right, or rainy day, you have little to no solar generation, right? But the grid, because there's so much solar power now, that's a huge impact as solar comes on and goes off like throughout the day, right? So they have to be able to adjust because you have to keep those levels just right. Otherwise, right, like we saw in Spain and and Portugal, all of a sudden your grid goes down, right? So it's a very fine balancing act. So it's really fascinating. So they're trying to, you don't have 20 people now watching this. You have, AI watching it and then reporting up to like one or two people, right? That type of thing. So it's interesting type of work there, right? And then there's the idea, yeah, what if we have network security monitoring that we're doing in the environment, right? And they have, right, AI built in, right, to help identify, right, the different patterns again. And I've seen more use cases, and I do a lot of like vibe coding, right, in ChatGPT, kind of on the like creating attack tools for OT than on the defensive side. But it's not hard, and I've done some with, yeah, just creating like simple kind of signatures looking or kind of pattern recognition, right? So keep an eye on, oh, if somebody was to do a port scan or if they were trying to, make these changes over Modbus that looked really strange, right? And stuff like that's not hard to do. So it's not, again, you have to, just like in IT, if you know your existing pattern, you just look for the anomalies, right? The nice thing is the OT networks, if you compare it to IT, they are so much quieter. They're almost dead quiet compared to IT networks where you just have so much traffic. So
Right.
OT is especially you break down an OT network into multiple layers, but those lower layers where the OT assets, the PLCs, the HMIs, where they actually sit, it's very limited traffic and it's very easy, it's very deterministic to know what's going to happen and when. So
Mm.
when you see things out of the ordinary, that that throws up a red flag and that you should investigate. Yeah.
Sure.
So defense and OT is not hard, but you
Mm.
have to be doing things like network security monitoring. Like I said,
Right.
unfortunately, just people just don't have the money to do it. That's why it's not happening.
So I'm going to ask you a very unfair question, but I'm curious as to how you answer this. Do you think that AI is going to play a more beneficial or detrimental role in OT? Because you're going to have it both ways,
For
right?
sure.
The
Oh, for sure.
defense is going to use it, and then the offense is going to use it.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually talk about this a lot. So not unfair. Because again, I do a lot more again, more from the attack, like the kind of red team perspective. Um, because a lot of like OT pen test tools, like they're 20 years old. You try to run them on like a Kali Linux box today, it's like it barfs because you're like got Python 3. I'm like, oh, okay, I'll just rewrite it in like 5 seconds with ChatGPT and I'm done, right? Um, so yeah, I think it's one of those. I think time will tell, right? It's just obviously we know the attackers are using it, right? Like crazy, right? And I think they're ramping up on it even faster in some respects than a lot of defenders. So I think defenders are starting to come along with it as well, but I think we are far behind the curve. I saw somebody talking one day about, oh, AI, it already has us like um, ahead of the curve of the attackers. I was like, uh, you know, I've heard that like I can't tell you how many times over the years, right? And it's like every time I hear it, I just want to throw up because it's like, I'm sorry, I guess I'm supposed to want for the day, right? That yeah, we're ahead of the attackers and we can stop them. But at the same time, I just don't ever see it. It's going to happen, right? And it's always just that ever escalating, war of back and forth, and it's we build the nuke and then they build right the shield, but then you build another nuke to go through the shield and then you build a bigger shield to detect it's just the back and forth. So I just think it's going to be a lot of that. So I think it's going to be really interesting,
Of course.
especially over the next couple of years to see what's happening or going to happen. But I do think it's just going to be a lot of kind of back and forth. It's going to help the attackers, you know, do what they do. It's going to help the defenders do what they do. I don't think it's going to be a silver bullet for anybody. It's just going to help them. It's kind of that expression that, you know, money doesn't make people jerks, right? It's like,
Yeah.
money, if somebody gets rich all of a sudden, it just amplifies who they are. If they were
Yeah.
a jerk before money, they're going to be a super jerk when they have money. If they're super
Of
nice,
course.
right? So it's
Yeah.
it's kind of like that for me. It's like the attacker is just going to give them more, you know, abilities and
Yeah.
tools, right? Same thing with the defenders. So
Yeah, I can't remember what the tool is off the top of my head. It's a local version of like Claude and Gemini and ChatGPT that's basically have all the how do I want to say this, the good behavior checks turned off, and it helps you pen test. And I can't recall the tool's name, but it just, we were talking about earlier about how getting a foothold onto the OT network is the easy part. The hard part is mapping out the system. It's like that
yeah,
sounds like a perfect role for unleashing AI of like, map this system, tell me what it does, tell me how I can do X, Y, and Z.
yeah. One of the things that AI is still, I mean, it's not great at today. It's definitely better than it was, and it's of course getting exponentially better every day. It's still not. it still struggles with like complex math and engineering. So I think, of course, another year or two, right, which is going to go by in the blink of an eye. It's not, it's yeah, one day soon for sure. I mean, you could totally see something that gains access is able to map out all the systems. What if it has all of the, the programming, the logic data, right, that it steals from the
Right.
engineering workstations, and it has the
Right.
data from those data historic, so it has that historical telemetry data.
Right.
And then it's also able to, it, uses the unauthenticated access, right, to these different
Right.
controllers to read values in real time over time, right? And it
Right.
finds these screenshots and is able to interpret those. Yeah, it could like literally pull these environments apart, I would think, in a pretty short amount of time. Yeah,
Something to look forward to.
right. Like I
So
said, hopefully it's just I'll take a bad incident, but hopefully nobody dies.
yeah,
So
yeah, of course, of course. So I wanted to ask you, so when it comes to physical access of these types of systems and networks and what have you,
yeah,
one of the things that I hear from prospective clients all the time is they're basically concerned with a variation of bad guy walks into an OT environment with something like a bash bunny, plugs it in and does
mhm,
bad thing, right?
sure.
Well, that makes sense on an unlocked laptop. That makes sense to an extent on a server rack. But does it
Sure.
make any sense at all in an OT environment?
It could more than likely if I mean the damage is in if you're in the OT environment, you're still going to be looking for the same things just like in IT, the servers, the workstations, right, running Windows. So those because realistically, when you look at PLCs, right, they do run embedded, custom firmware, right? It's not Windows, so you're not gonna, might not even have a USB drive, right, to even plug something in. Um, Now, where it gets interesting is we talk about like those GUIs that we're talking about, the human machine interfaces. A lot of those actually run Windows these days. So you're actually, it's kind of like this middle ground. So that's why I always say like that. If I was doing a pen test, that's my first target because if I do get on that and they do have network security monitoring, it's kind of like in IT, right, where you compromise the printer and you attack everything from the printer because if somebody's
Right.
watching there, oh, it's just the printer, don't worry about it,
Yeah, yeah.
right? So they'd be like, "Oh, it's just the HMI. Oh,
Right.
don't worry about it."
Right.
That type of thing. So that would always be my first target.
Interesting.
So yeah. So I mean, potentially, but then it goes back to once they have access to the machine, right? Once you get that foothold on the OT network, that's where again you have to go through that whole process of mapping out what's there, figure out the relationships, understand how the logic works on these systems, what they're actually controlling out in the real world. And that's right. When you think about it, it's like it's actually pretty hard if I'm not actually in the environment, right? You have to visualize and be able. That's why, like with Volt Typhoon, they wanted that GIS data because that actually basically a lot of these GIS data is basically a 3D model of
Right.
your plant, right?
Right.
And you can put as much data into it as you want. So it could include your control system data. You could see, oh, this PLC controls this turbine or
Right.
right this conveyor belt and that type of thing. So they get very specific if you put that information in. So those types of things. So yeah, it's just it goes back to yeah, it's again, it's I always assume, right, in the OT network, somebody gets in, like, right, they'll have access of all the Windows machines like that,
Right.
right? Just
Right.
like in IT. But then it's okay, they have to take the time to map it out, reverse
Right.
engineer, and then be able to put themselves in a position, right, to have that impact.
So what do you think, just rough estimate, the time delay would be from they get an initial foothold into the system from to they could blow something up or they understand the system enough that they could actually
Yeah.
cause something. Like what do you think that delay
Yeah.
is?
Yeah, so and this was something that Rob Lee was talking about at B-Sides. So and he talks a lot about um kind of he jokes about the like when he was in the Air Force and then got loaned out to the NSA. And now he's in the Army. So it's a real in the reserves. Um, but he talks a lot about why he actually got out originally, because General came to him and said, we were talking, why don't you take out that power plant because it powers that military base? And he's like, yeah, but it powers all of these civilian infrastructure, right? And he's very anti touching civil, as we all should be, right? Um, but along those lines, he talks. He has a he has a joke. He's like, so that general comes to me and says, "We want you to take out that power plant." He's like, "Okay, I need 6 months and $1 million and 20 people." And so I think about 6 months, maybe 6 to 9 months. Um, and and of course, Rob always jokes. He's like, or you can just get a Air Force pilot and ask him, "Hey, what do you need to take out the power plant?" And then he's like, "Oh, just give me 6 hours to sober up, and I'll go drop a bomb." So I like, and that's like this, yeah, and that's kind of where Stuxnet came from, right? They didn't
Right.
want to drop bombs;
Right.
they wanted to take a non ballistic approach, I guess
Right.
you would
Yeah.
say. So yeah, I hear 6 to 9 months from my nation state adversary friends that I talk with.
So, is there anything that you could do from a monitoring perspective or from a periodic sweep if you need 6 to 9 months of a foothold in order to map it out to find how it works? Could you detect that network discovery in that time frame? Like why is it so difficult for these guys to find them?
Well, again, it's just going back. They're not watching, right? If you were doing the network security monitoring, right? As soon as somebody, I mean, and this is the thing, if in an OT environment, I know that this HMI, right, this GUI, right,
Right.
it only controls this PLC.
Right.
So if this thing talks to anything else on the network, right? Because if I compromised it doing my pen test, right, and I'm like, oh, I can, let me see if I can just ping anything else out, right? If I see a ping, right, going to any other IP address on the network, I should be right on that thing and figuring out what the heck just happened.
Right.
But
Sure.
nobody's watching. But it really, if you were watching, it's as simple as that.
Right.
But again, yeah, there's
What do
very
you
few people watching.
So you're saying very few. If you had to give me a rough guess of the OT environments that you've seen that actually monitor, is it 5%, 10%?
That's yeah. That's my number comes from Rob, who also leads the the world's largest OT network security monitoring company. So
Right.
sure, I guess he's biased from that, but at the same time, I think he just comes from a, I want to share this knowledge with the world because we
Right.
are not prepared for what's
Yeah.
coming.
Sounds like it.
And yeah, he says his gut tells him roughly about 5%. And then I always add on, like, half of them are probably not doing a really good
Yeah.
job, honestly.
Well, that's terrifying. Um,
Right? And that's like Dragos does an awesome report every year, the year in review report that does kind of like the current state of the threat landscape.
right.
And they come up with these amazing things, including like 65% of the OT networks that they saw had active SSH connections to the internet from the
Wow.
OT network. Like, right, mind blowing. But then that's only watching maybe 5% of the networks that are out there. What would we see if we were watching 100% or 50%? It's
Okay. So just to be very clear here, could you tell people who may not understand, who may not be technical, why would it be a terrible thing for a power plant to have an open SSH connection to the internet?
right. Yeah. So yeah, the idea in that case, right? If you were doing a pen test or if you were an attacker, once you get that you gain access to a host in the OT network, even if it's just one of those Windows machines,
Right.
right? In a perfect world, the OT network is not able to open up any connections to the internet, right? Because
Right.
that's where our attackers are going to live, right? I mean, period,
Largely.
the end, right? Unless, sure, somebody could be on the inside, but vast majority of the time, the attackers are in the internet. If OT cannot connect or talk with the internet, then vast majority of our risk is reduced.
Right.
Um, yes, there's IT still, but you get the idea, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm an attacker and I'm sitting in Russia,
Right.
right, and I'm targeting a power plant or petrochemical facility in the United States, if I get
Right.
that initial foothold in the OT network,
Mm.
then I can open up that reverse shell or that connection from the OT network to the computer I can control. So it's
Right.
like a VPN connection, essentially, right? And the whole point of a
Sure.
VPN connection is it allows me to act like I'm sitting at that machine, even though I'm on the other side of the planet,
Right. Yep.
right? And of course, with also with SSH, it's encrypted, so you don't. If you are doing network security monitoring, then right, you couldn't be able to read the traffic. Of
Right.
course, if you were doing network security monitoring, you should see, oh, SSH to the internet, that's not good. We need to
Right.
stop that. So,
Right.
and that's why I say, even if you're not doing network security monitoring, you need to be watching your firewall logs
Of course.
because you could see something like, internet connectivity.
Right. So, okay. So just to terrify me even farther, so about 5% of OT environments, which again include things like water treatment facilities, power, rail lines, pretty much everything that keeps you, in civilization, is actually
Mhm.
doing its due diligence and monitoring things. But according to you, it's probably closer to 2.5%. And then,
Yeah, doing a
and
real
then,
job
so
at it.
so then you have constantly engineers and consultants and people coming into the environments, plugging in their phones and USBs and all kinds of random stuff. So it
Hmm.
it does not sound very good. It sounds
No.
terrible.
And I come right when I talk, it's like I try not to do the fear and the uncertainty doubt, right? And it's all about like how defense is very doable, right? And easy to do in OT, right? That's
Right.
the main message I want to get across, but it it usually turns out that yeah, it's just terrifying people. It's like no, I mean it's just that's the state of where we're at today.
Wow. Okay.
And again, you kind of the big question, well, why don't we see more things blowing up is, right, and it's just because yeah, it takes time to put
Right.
yourself in a position, right, to do that. But other than that, it's not hard to get in and create a temporary blackout for a couple minutes. Now, taking down the plant for a couple days, that's a whole other story.
Well, I don't know if you saw this happened. I think it was last week or the week before last, or it was very recent. If I remember correctly, some attackers were able to get into an OT infrastructure of a dam in Norway and open up the
Yeah,
floodgates for quite a while.
right. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's one of those where nobody got hurt, nobody was
No,
killed, right? But
no,
it's a great example of there was an impact in the real
right,
world that attackers created.
right,
And so it's like, let's use this as a lesson to learn from, right? And I mean, I was doing this for a long time in IT. It's like you see something in the news, you're like, could that happen to us, right? And if
yeah,
it's like, what do we need to do to prevent that from happening to us? And that's what a lot of OT environments should be asking, right? Themselves, right? They
yeah,
see the story and they're like, oh, I'm a power plant. That's a dam,
right,
right? Two different things.
right,
No, I'm like, sure, on the surface, but from a networking perspective and even from a control perspective, I, an OT environment is an OT environment. A power you defend a power plant just like you
right,
would defend that dam, just like you
right.
would defend right, water treatment and so on. So
Yeah, so yeah, it's shocking to me, and it's also shocking to me how ill prepared governments are when it comes to this because
yeah,
they're supposed to have backup plans. And being over here in Europe, I'm not going to go into who, and I'm not going to say exactly how many, but I was shocked at some of the locations over here and how few things like emergency mobile substations they have on station. And
Right.
it's like, so,
Yeah.
so for people who don't know, when a substation goes offline for whatever reason, squirrels, bullets, fire, whatever, you have to bring in this basically a substation on the back of a truck and take off the load and all this kind of stuff. But wow, are there not a lot of them? And
No, that's what, right. I know when we had the hurricane come through here, they were all surprised we were able to get one up in Asheville, which is up in the mountains. But it's a very large, like million, people city up in the mountains. And so yeah, they were really surprised. But it's kind of cool to go check it out.
sure.
Actually see it in action. But yeah, it's yeah, and that was interesting why Rob Lee went back into the army because one of his reasons was what if attackers did take down the grid like in the US, right? Or what if you had, multiple attacks, right, going on all these power plants at the same time? Everybody wants to call Dragos. Well, Dragos only has so many people to respond, right? There's no national response. There's nobody to help. There's nobody to step in. And what if the grid went down? You have to coordinate the restoration, starting with all the small power plants, and then you build into the larger ones. There's nobody to coordinate that. So
Right.
if that type of attack happened today, we're out, out of luck. So
Well,
that's a big,
well, and I don't think that people understand the time scale. I think that people have this misunderstanding that if the power were to go out, it'll be just like it always does. It'll come back in later today. Like if the power goes out, it'll be back by tomorrow. And I
right.
don't think they understand that if the power grid goes offline or enough substations go down or whatever, or it's not coming back tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's really easy to create a blackout for a couple seconds, maybe a couple minutes, especially for like a smaller, like a city block, or
Right.
maybe even a city, right? That's
Yeah.
actually not that hard to do, believe it or not. But when you start talking about like taking down the grid, massive blackouts for like a city that lasts more than like a couple seconds,
Yeah.
that takes a lot of effort. But if somebody actually did, yeah, like, and again, chances of this occurring are like slim to none. But what if the
Right.
grid, we still have to ask those questions, right? And what if the
Right.
grid did go down? How would we respond, and how would we coordinate that response?
Well, one of the attack vectors that I've seen talked about quite a bit is specifically targeting physically substations because they're sitting in
Yeah,
the middle of
for
nowhere. They're
sure.
not guarded by anything. And if they go
No,
offline, then there are really not a lot of mobile substations that can take them. And I understand that
no.
most grids have different routes that you can route the energy through in case
Right.
a
It's kind of like the
substation goes.
internet, right? Yeah.
Exactly. But there's only so many. Like it doesn't. If
Right.
you had 10, 20, 30 people who were all coordinating, that might be enough.
Yeah.
At least for a while. But yeah, it is terrifying.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah. Exactly.
you were talking about all your pen testing, and you were talking about getting into pen testing and being kind of shocked that how much Windows servers there was. And I'm just kind of curious in your experience, have you ever been on an OT pen test where you actually got really surprised, like you found yourself in the wrong, like you thought you were still in the IT environment, and oh, you were actually in production OT environment, or any kind of
There.
like crazy story that you can talk about?
Yeah. Just, I mean, you come across those environments where, I mean, unfortunately, and I see it, and this is actually extremely large manufacturing client, not in my day job, just to specify, um, and global organization. If I named them, anybody would know them. They do not have firewalls between IT and OT.
Oh, that's fun.
So, and like there's I shouldn't say this, but like their thing is like, oh well, we can monitor all the OT systems from IT. It's like
Nice.
I get, like, I see where you're coming from, and like like I can appreciate it, like from a monitoring availability perspective, but from the cybersecurity aspect, that's the exact last thing we want to have happen, right? And and they called me because they had just had a ransomware outage at one of their plants, and so I said, yeah, we need good firewalls between IT and the plant. And then I don't, they kind of didn't understand, I guess. And then they're like, oh, well, and then, well, we had this other plant and it had an outage. And then we had this other plant and it had an outage. And we had this other plant. Like, yes, you can stop all of these outages if you put a firewall between IT and OT. And let's do the monitoring of OT from within OT.
Yeah.
And it's like it goes back to the conversation of how much is it going to cost you to be down, right, for an hour or a day, right? And how much are you losing? Because and these plants, right, they don't need like, a huge, you can get away with a $500 firewall even if you wanted to, right, to
Yeah.
protect them, right? Just go get firewalls, get two, right? And yeah, and you'll save yourself like a whole world of hurt.
Yep.
So, like I said, a lot of it right now is still, it's like IT was 10, ish years ago. So it's still a lot of awareness and education. Because yeah, I'm like, yeah, I was them 20 years ago, on the IT side, right?
Right.
I get it. I get it,
Right.
so it's, totally get it. But yeah, that's honestly but that type of situation or similar I
Yeah.
see far too often. Or like they there's like the firewall's wide open, right? So they have the firewall between IT and OT, but it's
Yeah.
like wide open. Or there was one environment where they had a firewall, but there was a route that went around around the firewall. So it was like, oops,
Uh, that sounds like a
you
compliance
tried.
guy. Yeah, it sounds like a compliance guy. No, we have it.
Right, exactly, right. Yeah, we have a firewall. And sure, it's configured and it's very restrictive. Like that's great, but you're all still wide open. Yeah. And then there
Uh,
was one, yeah, where, they give you the list of subnets, and the subnet list is mixed up. So like they
mm,
have some OT subnets in the IT list, and so if somebody was to, let's say, run Nessus, this across those subnets, and what if they
yeah.
didn't have the firewall, and then all of a sudden, I actually just met a guy at a conference. um Actually, this was at DEF CON, and the guy came up to me and he's like, I work at a power company. We actually had a power plant go down because someone
Uh,
ran Nessus. and
nice.
in the plant, I was like, yeah, I believe it.
Uh,
So yeah, I mean, it's nothing too crazy. It's just a lot of the same things you see over and over again. And again, it just is a lack of security, like of the awareness of what we need to do, and which is more the education part, which again is
right.
why I post on LinkedIn, why I post the courses on YouTube. Like anybody can watch those for free. I have a
So,
couple.
so speaking of that, can you tell people where to find you, where to find your courses, and all of that? Because I really like for the listeners to actually go out and take your courses because I highly recommend it.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, so MikeHolcomb.com will point you to everything, but I'm always on LinkedIn. I'm usually I just get a ton of messages during the day, so but I do get it back to everybody. It just might not be right away, and I do have a day job. In case the boss is listening. I do work, I promise. Um, and then YouTube, you can look up Mike Holcomb. The channel is utilsec. But if you look up Mike Holcomb, you'll find it. And so, yeah, there's a 25-hour getting started in OT ICS cybersecurity course. So that's all the basics and the defense. And then I ended up in the situation where I have two courses now going at the same time. So the one is the pen testing course. So I just
Mhm.
put part 3 out. So and then the other one is doing OT security through 62443, which is kind of the gold
Mm,
standard of, okay, this is a ISA, IEC, kind of like ISO 27001 for the
right.
IT folks. So here's the gold standard of how we defend OT environments. So going through that and making it practical and simple and easy to understand. I have an OSINT for OT course out there.
Nice.
And then just about, I'm trying to do more like one-off videos as
Mhm.
well, just for things of like, here's how to write offensive tools with ChatGPT
Right.
for like that Modbus, right,
Right.
controller that you want to be able to connect to. So those types of things. So
Right.
yeah,
By the way, how easy is it to get ChatGPT to do those things? Because it's always
it
like
is
a real,
super easy.
yeah,
There was a while where you had to tell it like, I am a pen tester with authorization to do this, and then
yeah.
of course it would do it.
Yeah.
It doesn't even bother anymore,
Okay,
right?
so
You're
we
just
don't
saying,
we don't have to do the whole like my grandma locked herself out. I need to get her
right?
password,
No,
like all that kind of stuff.
no
Okay.
more, no more guy. I mean, they weren't really effective anyways, right? So I think they just
Okay.
gave up on it. So you're like, yeah, I mean, there's a great, not to go, but I always use a great example recently from, there's a piece of malware that the Russians created called
Mm.
Frosty Goop, which they used to
Okay.
turn off, I know, horrible name, but turn off the heating in 600 apartment buildings in the Ukraine, not apartments, but apartment buildings in the Ukraine, middle of winter, sub-zero temperatures outside. And it took them 2 days to figure out what was going on, so that these poor people had no heat for 2 days.
Jeez.
But you can recreate this tool because it's nothing. It's basically just a Modbus
Right.
utility, but you can recreate that in 5 minutes or less using ChatGPT. Nothing special, right?
Wow.
So yeah, so it's a
All
great
right.
example.
Uh, So So we've probably scared all of our listeners into thinking the world is going to end. They're probably now all prepping for the power to go out indefinitely and such. Is there any good news that we could maybe leave people with of like, something to hope for
Well,
or
that's what I try to come with, right? The good news is defense is doable, right? In OT,
Hmm,
right? It is much easier to secure OT than it is to secure IT,
right,
believe it or not, right? There's actually, I use the extra less moving pieces in OT, even though of course it's moving out in the real world, but you get the
right,
idea. It's much more straightforward to be able to protect and defend OT, even just with the basics, backup and recovery, right? Having that firewall, right? We always talk about secure network architecture, right? The firewall between IT and OT. If you had the firewall between IT and OT and you did not let IT talk with OT at all, that's the
hmm,
vast majority of your risk. It's not
wow,
all of your risk, but it's the vast majority of risk because the vast majority of your attacks come from IT. That's
right,
just a fact. So yeah, it's, again, the good news, it's very doable.
hmm,
It's very doable. We're just at this point, yeah, it's just like IT was 10 years ago,
right,
that people are still just now figuring out, oh, I should probably do something about cybersecurity,
right,
right? Or maybe they were just getting to that point a year or two ago, and now they're just getting to where they're starting to do something about it, or they're starting to talk about doing something about it, right? And at the end of the day, also, we just don't have a lot of people to help,
hmm,
right? And get that awareness and get that education out there, right? And like we also mentioned, the sad thing is so many of these environments, they're so small, they're
right,
just never going to have the resources to do much, if anything, until yeah, they get popped, and whatever service they provide to the world goes down,
right.
right?
Oh,
So
all right. Well, Mike,
that was
thank
another
you.
bad note. Sorry.
No, 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 no. It's good though. But I mean, it's really good because you've presented a simple solution that anyone should be able to do that covers the vast majority of issues, and uh, yeah, I mean, it's a simple solution. So anybody who's listening to this who is in the OT environment, call Mike and have him fix things for you.
I appreciate that.
All right, man. But thank you, Mike. Thanks very much for being here. It's been a pleasure
Yeah, thanks
chatting
for
with
having me.
you.
Yeah, it
Um,
was fun.
But
Definitely.
all right, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this, and yeah, go take Mike's course because it's a lot of fun, and you'll definitely. I mean, like you said, he needs more people in OT pen testing.
Absolutely. And you don't have to be an engineer. You can come from IT just like I did. So.
Perfect. All right. Thanks everybody for being here. Talk to you later. Bye bye.